Hey, how's it going? I'm Mitch. This is History Doodles, and this is going to be a weird sentence, but there's a man named Herodotus who I can only in my head compare to Anthony Bourdain, except for this guy lived 2,500 years ago and was into art, culture, and history instead of food. He traveled all around the ancient Mediterranean, and he talked to people and learned their stories about their history, and he wrote them all down in a book called The Histories. My favorite of all these stories centers around a man named Cyrus, or Cyrus the Great, one of the most influential people who ever lived, and the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Today we're going to be retelling that story, so without further ado, let's dive in. So a little bit more about our ancient Bourdain, Herodotus. He was a Greek from Halicarnassus, and he lived in the 5th century BCE. He's most famous for his book, The Histories, and his book has led to a lot of controversy since his era, leading him to be called the father of history by some and the father of lies by others. But a couple important things must be mentioned about our author. First, he was biased. He probably intended this book to be recited orally in front of groups of people, groups of Greeks, and he thought of it closer to like a one-man show than a textbook. Second, his histories are riddled with hearsay. He collected this information in his book from traveling all around the Mediterranean and talking to people from these foreign lands about how they understood their own past and present. And that's great, but it's unlikely to give us an entire picture of what's going on. So caveats aside, he is one of the few contemporary sources from this time. So it's kind of the best we got. And it's absolutely incredible that his writing from 2,500 years ago is still around to us today. And it gives us a portal into people how that long ago thought about their world. So, his story about Cyrus, he starts by introducing a man named Astayges, who is the king of the Medes. His kingdom was based in modern-day Iran, and his capital was in Ecbatana. Apparently, Astyages had a vivid and horrifying dream one night, and it had him shook. Herodotus retells us the story of that dream, which centers around Astyages' daughter, who was named Mandane. And because you might not believe me if I put it in my own words, Herodotus writes that Astyages' dream was that, quote, one night, she, his daughter Mandane, had urinated such enormous quantities that it had filled his city and swamped the whole of Asia. He told his dream to the Magi, whose business it was to interpret such things, and he was much alarmed by what they said it meant, end quote. The Magi were somewhere like between a priest and a sorcerer in the Zoroastrian religion, and the kings in this region relied on them for guidance. In this case, Astyages came to them with his dream of his daughter's catastrophic bedwetting event, and they interpreted it as a prophecy that Mandane's son would one day cause chaos and downfall of the Medes. Astyages took this interpretation very seriously, and so he married his daughter off to a guy named Cambyses, who he thought was a quiet and non-threatening choice for a husband. And he hoped that relegating his daughter to some far-off land with a super boring husband would mean that their eventual children would be no threat to him and the empire. And then, but before Mandane and Cambyses had been married a year, Astyages was hit with a second dream. And this time he saw vines coming out of his daughter's private parts that spread all across Asia. This equally weird and gross dream was interpreted by the Magi again, who advised him that he send for his daughter immediately. And when she arrived, they learned that she was pregnant. Soon afterwards, Mandane gave birth to a boy named Cyrus. And Astyages was convinced that this young boy would grow up and bring destruction to his empire. So to deal with the problem, he recruited his most trusted confidant named Harpagus, and he told Harpagus to go to his daughter and kill her infant son. Now, Harpagus was loyal to the king, and he couldn't stomach doing it himself, so he found one of the king's herdsmen named Mithridates to do it for him. He instructed this herdsman to take the infant out to the mountains and leave it outside so he would die from exposure. And so this poor herdsman, Mithridates, was left with an impossible task of killing an infant. And before doing anything, he just brought the child back to his family home. Now, by happenstance, his wife, Spako, had just experienced an unfortunate miscarriage. And Spako proposed that they just keep this boy, and they raise it as their own. And then they swap out the stillborn so that it could be left outside at the foot of the mountain. And then they could report to Harpagus that the boy had been killed. And when they looked for the body as proof, they would find it. Problem solved. And the plan worked, at least initially. Cyrus, who went by another name as a boy in these false pretenses, grew up in Mithridates' nice family home, and he never knew anything different. He would just hang out with the other kids in Medea and play with the other herdsmen's kids, play 9,000 or whatever the hell they did, and just generally be one of the boys. But then at age 10, there was an incident that he revealed he wasn't just some average kid. Apparently, a bunch of kids his age were playing a game of king, where one person gets to be king and they give out orders. And Cyrus was the king in this game, and he commanded the other boys to perform their roles. And one kid disobeyed Cyrus's orders. And then Cyrus got the other kids to arrest him. And then, as Herodotus puts it, quote, Cyrus beat him savagely with a whip, end quote. So this poor kid that just got whipped by all his friends comes home crying to his parents, and unfortunately his father was a high-ranking member of the Mede government. And now somehow this complaint wound its way all the way up to the desk of the king, who brought in Cyrus and his herdsman father Mithridates for questioning. And during this interrogation process, young Cyrus's answers were so kingly and unusual for a 10-year-old that Astayges knew something was going on. And then he started to realize the boy kind of looked like him, and that his age corresponded with the date he supposedly had his grandson killed, and it all clicked. So Mithridates was then brought into a separate room, and Astayges threatened to torture him if he didn't spill the tea. And everything about the conspiracy 10 years earlier was found out immediately. He then called in Harpagus, his confidant, and had him tell his side of the story. Harpagus told the king he was just as shocked as Astayges that the boy was alive. So faced with the reality of the situation, Astayges remained calm initially, and he told Harpagus he felt relieved that the boy was alive. He commanded Harpagus to bring his own son to the palace for a royal feast, so that the two boys could play together and get acquainted. Harpagus must have felt like he had dodged a bullet. And at the royal feast, nothing was unusual and out of place at first. The meal consisted of a mutton dish, and it was served to all the guests, and everything was fine, until the end of the meal, in which Astayges asked Harpagus if he had enjoyed it. Harpagus responded that he had, and then another dish was brought out. But on this dish was served the severed hands and feet and head of a human. Harpagus was told that he had just eaten the flesh of that person, and that it was the punishment for failing to follow through with the king's orders 10 years earlier. It dawned on Harpagus that he had been served the flesh of his own son. He just had to sit there and take it too, for any reaction would result in his death. Next, Astayges consulted the Magi on what to do with Cyrus, and they came to the conclusion that since he was alive, they might as well return him to his real parents. So Cyrus was spared, and he was accompanied by guards and took him to his parents in Persia, Mandane and Cambyses. Years later, Cyrus grew up and became one of the most popular and charismatic people in Persia. Those around him could tell he was destined for greatness, and the word of his rise made it all the way to where he grew up in Medea. This caught the attention of Harpagus, who was still working for Astayges, even after, that terrible thing he did to him. Harpagus then sent a secret letter, hidden in the corpus of a hare, to Cyrus, with a note that pleaded for Cyrus to lead an uprising in Persia and attack Astayges and the Medes, and he assured him if he did this, he would be successful. So Cyrus held up his end of the bargain, and he started an uprising in Persia, and it gathered a huge army to attack the Medes. The more powerful Median army was sent to squash this rebellion, and it was led by none other than Harpagus. And when the two armies met, Harpagus and his soldiers laid down their arms and defected to the Persian side. Astayges was furious, and he had the Magi who told him to let Cyrus live impaled. And then he tried one more last-ditch effort to assemble an army and defeat the Persians, but it was too late, and his army was defeated and he was taken alive. Now, in a telling display of mercy, Cyrus spared his grandfather Astayges, and he even allowed him to retain some power and incorporated him into a court. And this is a pattern that would be repeated throughout Cyrus's life. He is known to history as someone who's displayed clemency and pragmatism rather than brutality and violence. Now, whatever the reality is with Cyrus's background, and it's very unlikely that Herodotus gave us all the right details from that wild story, the real Cyrus did for sure to take this budding Persian force and defeat the greatest kingdoms in the world at that point, and expand his empire all the way from modern-day Pakistan to Turkey. And the result would be the Persian Empire, and his dynasty, the Achaemenids, would rule this huge area for 200 years. And what really adds to Cyrus's legacy, and what keeps him as a popular figure even today, is that all the way he dealt with the people he conquered in a way that was more lenient and liberal than something you might expect from the ancient world. Now, whether this is for political pragmatic reasons over some sense of higher morality is debatable, but what we do know about him shows a man of unusual character. Additionally, he would have an explicit policy of freedom of religion, and he allowed his subjects to maintain their own lifestyle and pray to whatever god or gods they chose, as long as they prayed for him. This fact even makes its way into the Old Testament of the Bible, because during his reign he allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland in the kingdom of Judah, and even paid for the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. Because of the lack of source material about Cyrus from over 2,000 years ago, we don't know for sure what happened with a lot of the things you'd hoped you'd know about his life. For example, the details around his death around 530 BC are up for debate. In just 30 years, this man was able to establish so much that would change the world forever after him, but the details about how he died are really murky. And even Herodotus admits he doesn't know much about the truth behind Cyrus's death, and that he had actually heard many stories about what had happened to him. Herodotus does, however, give us one story which he thinks is possible, and he tells us that Cyrus died in the Eurasian steppe fighting a tribe called the Masagiri. They were a nomadic horse tribe, and he describes them as people who drank from cups made of skulls, that they had slept with multiple partners, and they smoked marijuana. They were basically like juggalos of the ancient plains. And that's a story that warrants an episode in its own right, but I don't have time here. So suffices to say that the real Cyrus deserved the title King of Kings, and he seems to have been a person of amazing character and political skill. And the details that we do have about him, even if they are punched up a bit from our ancient source Herodotus, are so amazing that you can't help but hope it's true. And that'll do it for our story about Cyrus and our friend Herodotus. So I hope you had fun and learned something, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.